Hello, History 17B Spring Quarter 2024. This is a little bit of an experiment. This is my first time trying to talk for any extended period. So I may very well have to cut this video in two, but that won't be a big deal. We are on Module C. Americans during the Progressive Era thought of themselves as making progress on all sorts of things. Certainly, there were technological and medical developments, but the idea of progress suggests progressing or moving toward something, meaning there's an end point or goal. The problem with this is that in a country with millions, that goal is not going to be the same for everyone. So, whose vision of progress counts? And perhaps more to the point, whose does not? Today, we are zooming in on industry and taking a closer look at how industrial workers lived and what owners did with their profits. The title of the lecture is The Profit Motive and Self-Made Men, Industrialization, Urbanization, and Wealth Disparity. Industrialization came up previously with innovations in industrial capitalism. Think vertical and horizontal integration, and with railroads. Industry really ramped up in the period of Module C, and industrial production skyrocketed. But the boom-bust linkages with Europe would not disappear, although booms would benefit the wealthy most, and busts would cost them the least. This chart basically shows industrial growth from 1800 to 1910. You can see it's increasing slowly, picking up a bit in the antebellum or pre-American Civil War era. Industrialization starts to increase more in the time period of Module B, from the end of the Civil War to somewhere in the 1880s. And then it shoots up in the time period of Module C. Industry supplied and relied on other industry, so the growth became more and more rapid as it went on. The steam engine was actually a product of the first industrial revolution of the late 1700s to early 1800s. Steam engines powered railroads, but also early factories, which meant that there had to be factories to build the parts for other factories to build their engines and tools to fix them, and so on. The internal combustion engine needed gas to run, plus all the parts to make it, and it revolutionized transportation, which required more parts to be made. The vulcanization of rubber made raincoats more efficient, as well as tires, again, part of making the automobile a possibility, or more than a possibility, a reality. One more world-changing invention path. Often when I see essays on the invention of the sewing machine, they focus almost entirely on the home machine, but that was not the only kind. Industrial sewing machines revolutionized the production of clothing, but also upholstery and home furnishings. The sewing machines themselves required factories to supply parts, including things we don't always think about, like grease for gears. And sewing machines increased the demand for textiles, also made in factories. What you may have noticed in the three examples of snowballing industrialization here is that there are people in all of the factory images. Lots of people. Machines increased both speed of production and output, but they still required human labor and lots of it. That human labor had to live and sleep and eat and do regular human things. I chose the images on this slide because if you focus on the vanishing point in each, you get an idea of the size of factories and the sheer number of people it took to work them. Row after row after row of workers. These massive numbers of workers had to live somewhere, preferably close enough to the factory that they could use newly designed public transit to get to work. This meant an exponential growth in cities, or urbanization. Big cities like New York got bigger, and industrial cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh housed tons of workers. Here again, industry begot industry, but not all at once. And that meant that cities grew, but not always efficiently or logically. If you look closely at this image here, you can see the feet of the horse under the carriage here. The trouble with horses in a city is that they poop and they pee. Whose responsibility is it, if anyone's, to clean that up? For that matter, people produce waste as well. Same question. Who cleans up? How is it done? And who pays those workers? Where does the rubbish go? We've seen the issue with slaughterhouses and the water supply in New Orleans. The same problem came up in Chicago with its vast facilities for slaughtering cattle from Western ranches. But even just daily life produces rubbish, some of it rather nasty. Running water and sewage disposal were problems that were only solved after cities had grown massively in both the US and Europe. We've discussed that cities like New York, Chicago, New Orleans, and Detroit first developed where there were ports for shipping. Ports mean water, and water seems like a great way to dispose of waste, right? Unless you were drinking that same water, which was the case in almost all of these urban areas. Waste in water means disease. And germ theory, with its implications for managing contagion, arrived in the 1860s, which meant that developments in understanding how to deal with sewage could only come later. Chicago dealt with the ravages of typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases by actually reversing the flow of the river through the city. But this was a feat of engineering that could not happen in other cities. The image that you're looking at was taken during that river reversal project, and this one was taken around 1900. Think about all the tools and machines that needed to be produced for this project and the size of the labor force that would be required. The folks in this image here, it's a group of bigwigs looking at the progress of the work, not actual laborers. I briefly mentioned in an earlier lecture the fact that the Bessemer process of making steel meant that steel replaced wood as the framework for buildings, with the result that buildings could reach ever greater heights and house more and more factories and workers, both factories in these buildings with the workers sometimes. Cities that went up kept workers closer to their jobs, but closer is a relative measure. People needed to have transport to work. Electricity and engines made trolleys and cable cars possible, as you see on the left, and huge advances in engineering meant that cities could build down as well as up. The image on the right is the first New York subway, and if this was taken in 1904. And again, the image here is the bigwigs at the opening ceremony, but it kills me how tiny the train is and open. What a comparison to now. Jacob Riis immigrated from Denmark to Scotland in 1870. Between that year and 1900, somewhere in excess of 12 million people immigrated to the US, mostly settling in cities. Meanwhile, people born in the United States migrated from the countryside to cities as technology made it easier to increase farm production with less labor. Riis would go on to be a pioneer in muckraking photojournalism with his book, How the Other Half Lives. It was intended to expose the realities of poverty to the wealthy, but even more to the middle class, a topic that will come up in this module in a later lecture. You can still order printings of the book, How the Other Half Lives, on Amazon. Riis arrived in New York and concentrated his efforts on New York's Lower East Side. Following the Civil War, New York's wealthy residents left the Lower East Side for the Upper East Side, which remains a highly affluent district. Meanwhile, in the 1880s, over 300,000 people were crammed into a single square mile that constituted the Lower East Side. This particular image is from 1895. No plumbing, no real ventilation, and no electricity. Heating and cooking required open flame in this very flammable wooden slum. You can see what we typically think of as tenements going up in the background. By 1900, somewhere around 2.3 million people, about two-thirds of New York City's population, lived in the tenements growing upward. More rooms per acre of footprint, but not much change in plumbing, sanitation, waste disposal, or electricity. There are windows for some ventilation and light, but nowhere near enough for the number of residents, and the interior apartments and rooms had no windows at all. Laundry had to be scrubbed by hand in a tub of water, obtained from a tap somewhere in the neighborhood and lugged home, which generally meant upstairs. The laundry here is a testament to how hard these people, many of them women working in factories themselves, tried to keep their living spaces clean. This is the entirety of the apartment that this family occupies. You can see a stove over here on the left that burns probably wood, but possibly coal. That's the kitchen. The bedrooms are the beds. No bathroom. Using the loo meant either going to one of the few outside toilets that served the entire building or using a chamber pot with the family around. There are 7 people in this photo, but you can tell that their clothes and dishes are clean and as well kept as humanly possible. The floor is virtually spotless. Not everyone had the health or the stamina to maintain that level of care. The photo on the left was taken in 1905 and the one on the right in 1897. You could tell on the right that the man shown is not the only resident because there are multiple beds and multiple buckets. It was vanishingly rare that one person could afford even a one-room apartment of their own. Single men might pay for a bed or really part of a bed per night. You can see that there are at least 2 men in every bed in this photo. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and somebody else's feet over here. If you did not have enough money for a room or bed, if you were lucky, you could hunt up some floor space at the homeless shelter and provide your own bedding. But if that were filled, you had to get creative, like this fellow in the basement of either a tenement or a factory or both. Some of what you see down here is rat droppings. We've talked about separate spheres in live lecture, the ideal created for the middle class that separated the domestic or living sphere entirely from the world of work, with the home the domain of women and the work world that of men. When this is your domestic space, such an ideal is both meaningless and ridiculous. The image on the right was taken in 1887. It looks like the woman is sitting in a storeroom, but this is, in fact, her home. You can see the stove in the right foreground and various tubs for drinking water, cooking, cleaning, bathing, and so on distributed about. The bedding is piled up behind her during the day, so there is enough floor space to move around in. The fellow on the left and whomever he lived with have actually built this home under the Rivington Street dump. You can see in this photo, and if you look back at others here, the decoration put in these spaces to try to make them homes. Not all work could be finished by machines in factories, especially in the textile trades. People would do what was called piecework, meaning they would collect the materials to be assembled from a factory, take them home and do the required handwork, and then take the finished pieces, hence piece, back to the factory. This work was paid according to the number of finished pieces, which meant that piecework did not get recorded under shifts or hours worked. Here in this image, both men and women are making neckties in their home. Here, a family works together in their home to make silk flowers used on hats and dresses. The only one not working is the baby who is being cared for by another child. Once again, this is why it bothers me so much when people now apply the ideal of separate spheres to a past in which that ideal could not possibly be met. There is no separation of home and paid employment here. There are no separate spheres with women staying home to care for the family. The entire family had to take care of one another. This is not a world in which women did not work. Women worked in the home and out of it before middle-class women started to forge professional careers. HIS made it easy to show what New York looked like, but New York was not an exception, and HIS was not the only muckraker or journalist who sought to expose the realities of industry work. For example, Upton Sinclair wrote an expose of the meat processing industry in Chicago and the treatment of immigrant labor there. I try to keep your workload not too overwhelming in this class, so I don't have you read full books. However, not requiring and not recommending are two different things. If you want to get a better grasp on industrial America at the turn of the 20th century, The Jungle is short and easy to read rapidly. That was the bottom half, who handled the production side of things. Now we get to the stories of the great men of industry and take a peek in their homes, many of which have been turned into hotels or libraries or just open to tourists as museums if they were not demolished in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. William Rockefeller Jr. here founded Standard Oil in 1870 together with his brother, John D., and within a decade, the siblings were among the richest people in the world. In 1886, this Rockefeller paid the equivalent of $4.4 million in today's money to acquire the Rockwood Estate, which overlooks the Hudson River near Sleepy Hollow, New York. The oil tycoon then extended the property to 1,000 acres and transformed the existing house into what was essentially a 204-room castle. The interiors of Rockwood Hall were the handiwork of a highly sought-after group of designers. Suitably grand, these rooms included a great hall, library, drawing room, billiard room, and other formal spaces, all of which were furnished in luxury materials such as marble, oak, and onyx. The house also featured 14 master suites, and 15 servants' bedrooms. Following William Jr.'s death in 1922, the property passed to his nephew, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who sold it a year later. Rockwood Hall was reinvented as a posh country club, but the business floundered during the Great Depression and the building was demolished in the early 1940s. The richer of the Rockefeller brothers, that was the less rich one, John D., went on to become the world's first billionaire. A frequent visitor to his brother's estate, the wealthier sibling bought land in the nearby Pocantico Hills in 1893 and commissioned his own palatial mansion, which, like Rockwood, overlooked the Hudson. Rivaling Rockwood in splendor, the 40-room Beaux-Arts beauty was originally designed as a steep-roofed three-floor mansion. But why stop there? Plans were radically changed by celebrated architect William Wells Bosworth, who created a more ornate six-story Georgian Revival edifice. John Dee went all out on interiors, calling in a top interior designer who decorated the elegant neoclassical style rooms with English antique furniture, collections of prized Chinese and European ceramics, including Ming Dynasty pieces bought from the collection of banker J.P. Morgan. John Dee also equipped his estate with all the latest must-have amenities, including a private golf course and tricked-out coach barn filled with gleaming carriages and cars. Ultimately, the mansion served as home to four generations of the Rockefeller family, with each resident adding to its prestige and its art collection. Coke, that would be the coal processing product, not the beverage. Coke and steel baron Henry Clay Frick racked up a fortune second only to the Rockefellers and could afford to go all out on his Manhattan mansion. At its completion in 1913, the 61-room Fifth Avenue property was described as the most expensive and sumptuous house in America. The plot of land it stood on alone costing $76 million in today's money. Frick appointed the same firm that did Rockwood Hall's interiors. The brief was for a house that would be in good taste and not ostentatious. In case you are wondering why I am giving the robber barons so much space in lecture, I think that it is important to really grasp what they thought of as charity and philanthropy, meaning that they were willing to donate money to charity and found libraries or museums, but this must be done by forcing the lower classes to accept the values of the upper classes for the working class, and most particularly that the working class accept subservience and express gratitude. That, of course, was entirely alien to workers who wanted to be treated as adult humans, capable of understanding their own needs and with a right to their own desires. You have a reading in this module that goes toward that, but I think will be more effective if you have a visual. And since I cannot take you to these buildings in person, the next best is to make the inequities between worker and owner obvious through still images. Frick packed the mansion with collections of Renaissance and Rococo furniture, Meissen and Sèvres porcelain, Limoges enamels, and one of the finest privately held collections of paintings in the world, including works by Holbein, Vermeer, Goya, and Fragonard. The most impressive spaces may be the cavernous East and West libraries, which have concave glass ceilings. Frick lived in the property for just 5 years. At his death in 1919, the tycoon requested that mansion and contents, including the unbelievable art collection, become a museum. Frick also left $15 million, the equivalent of $241 million today, to fund the Eponymous, meaning named after him, art museum, which opened in 1935. The coda for this lecture shows clothing from the era, presented as art and exhibited recently in the Frick Museum. Aside from the Rockefellers, the other great dynasty of the so-called Gilded Age was that of the Vanderbilt clan, who built more than their fair share of over-the-top mansions with the money they raked in from shipping and railroads. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, for instance, ended up erecting New York City's largest and arguably grandest home. It's this whole thing here, not just this little bit, the whole thing. Constructed on what's called Millionaire's Row section of Fifth Avenue, the chateau-esque mansion required 600 artisans to toil away day and night on the huge project. The house, if you can call it that, featured 130 rooms, including a regal 65 by 50-foot ballroom, a Louis XIV style salon, and even a Moorish-influenced smoking room. The dining room was adorned with paintings by the likes of Constable, Rousseau, and Millet. John D. Rockefeller was usurped as the richest person in the world during the 1900s by arch rival Andrew Carnegie. The Scottish American industrialist spearheaded the expansion of the steel industry in the US, stockpiling a fortune that translates into hundreds of billions in today's money. A renowned philanthropist, Carnegie gave away a staggering 90% of his wealth during his lifetime, funding everything from charities to universities, but not raising wages for his workers. In 1898, he bought 1.3 acres of land along Fifth Avenue, a mile north of the most desirable stretch, and asked his architects to design the, quote, most modest, plainest, and most roomy house in New York. The mansion also had state-of-the-art technology. It was the first residence in America to be built around a steel frame and one of the first to have an Otis lift, meaning an elevator, and central heating. Another wow factor is the property's private garden, which is the largest in New York. In fact, part of Carnegie's reasoning when buying away from the most fashionable area was to ensure that there would be enough space for a sizable backyard. After Carnegie's death in 1919, his wife stayed in the house until her death in 1946, when it was bequeathed to the Carnegie Foundation. In 1972, the foundation gifted the building to the Smithsonian, and it is now occupied by the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum. Meatpacking heir J. Ogden Armour topped Chicago's rich list. So we've left New York now and moved on to Chicago. Armour was one of the wealthiest people in America during the early part of the 20th century. Melody Farms, the Armour's home in Lake Forest, Illinois, was completed in 1908 at the cost of a mere $305 million in today's money. The mansion was kitted out with French antiques from the 18th century, fancy columns, cornices, and paneling, gold doorknobs, not gold-colored, gold, 20 marble fireplaces, a carved walnut Georgian room transplanted wholesale from a London townhouse, plus a bowling alley. Other pricey features included an orangery, stables, ponds stocked with fish, and even a private power plant. Things did not actually end well for J. Ogden Armour. The meatpacking magnate went broke during the economic slump that followed the First World War, losing $1 million a day over 130 days. He did, however, manage to hold on to Melody Farms up until his death in 1927, but it was offloaded not long after and became part of the elite Lake Forest Academy Prep School in 1947. Nicknamed the King of New York, German-born financier Otto Hermann Kahn, not one of the best-known names generally, was one of the richest people during the Gilded Age and into the early 20th century. After his first country manor in Morristown, New Jersey, was gutted by fire in 1905, the banker went on to Huntington, Long Island. Kahn pulled out all the stops, hiring a top-notch firm to design literally a European-style castle, and went on to spend the equivalent of $158 million on the 127-room extravaganza, which at 109,000 square feet became America's second biggest private home upon its completion in 1919, bypassing Rockwood Hall. Determined his new fantasy property would not succumb to a blaze as his first mansion had, Kahn had what he called Oheka Castle, built in concrete and steel. Outside, the grounds included tennis courts, one of the country's largest complexes of greenhouses, stables, orchards, an 18-hole golf course, and even an airplane landing strip. Kahn died in 1934 after changing hands several times. In 1984, the former home was painstakingly restored and converted into a luxury hotel, which I have never stayed in. Edward T. Stotesbury was among the most prominent investment bankers of the Gilded Age and early 20th century, and one of the richest people in Philadelphia at the time, with a fortune equivalent to around $3 billion today. Construction began on White Marsh Hall, which you see here, in 1916. Once again, a famous architect was hired to design a stately 147-room manse, which at just 100,000 square feet would eclipse the White House in size and become America's third biggest private home. Dubbed the American Versailles, the residence was completed in 1921 at an estimated cost of $10 million at the time, or $155 million in today's money. The banker hosted lavish parties there for those in his socioeconomic class. After visiting White Marsh Hall, Henry Ford, the auto guy, declared that it was a great experience to, quote, see how the rich live. We will be looking at Ford's residence quite soon. White Marsh Hall served as a museum storehouse and a laboratory, but became derelict in the 1960s and 70s. It was demolished in 1980. The most jaw-dropping Gilded Age mansion of them all was built for George Washington Vanderbilt II, the brother of Cornelius Vanderbilt II. Beginning in 1889, over 1,000 workers were hired to construct the colossal 178,926 square foot residence on 700 parcels of land totaling 125,000 acres in scenic Asheville, North Carolina. Remembering that this sort of extraordinary privilege was justified because the titans of industry were self-made men, George W. Vanderbilt inherited $2 million from his grandfather and received another million on his 21st birthday from his father. Upon his father's death, he inherited $5 million more, as well as the income on a $5 million trust fund. The 250-room mansion was designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who is the architect behind the Statue of Liberty pedestal. Completed in 1895, the final bill for the unprecedented residence came to $1.6 billion in today's money. During its heyday, the property hosted the great and good of American society, from presidents to writers such as Edith Wharton and Henry James. Following George W.'s untimely death in 1914, his wife struggled with running the vast estate, which had become a major drain on her finances. Stung by taxes and the cost of maintaining Biltmore, as it was known, the widow Edith disposed of large swaths of the estate, and the home itself was opened to the public in 1930. Today, Biltmore is apparently one of North Carolina's most popular tourist attractions. Now we come back to Henry Ford, one of the richest self-made tycoons of all time, and the one who commented on pleasure and interest in seeing how the rich live. Henry Ford commissioned Fairlane, his 1,300-acre estate in Dearborn, Michigan, not far from where the auto pioneer grew up. The property encompassed a farm, a laboratory, an indoor pool and skating house, a bowling alley, a power plant, and numerous staff cottages, making it more like a village. Now, Ford really did fall under the category of self-made men. However, he knew how the rich lived. Inside, great care was taken in particular with the woodwork. The 29-foot banister seen on the left, for instance, was meticulously carved out of a single walnut tree. After the deaths of Ford and his wife, the house was stripped of many of its furnishings and used by the Ford Motor Company as a retreat. In 1957, it was donated to the University of Michigan, and Fairlane now operates as a museum. I, of course, am drooling over all of these bookshelves. Now back to the real world for most of us. Ford is famous for making cars, but also for bringing assembly line construction to factories. And we will come back to that in a moment. Factory owners wanted to maximize profits by paying workers as little as possible while getting as much out of them as possible. In the 1880s, Frederick Winslow Taylor, over here, whose book is on the right, observed workers looking for inefficient movements that cost the company time and money. Notice worker health was not of concern there at all. Taylor came up with scientific management, also called Taylorism. In this, he broke down worker movements into discrete, timed tasks, stringing together routines that increased production. This worked really well for employers, resulting in greater productivity. While wages stayed low, profits went up. Workers, as I suspect you have already realized, were not nearly so pleased. Workers were expected to work faster and faster. Speed up here, the term on the slide, is fairly self-explanatory. Workers could be fined for going too slowly. Workers also did not develop skills in these jobs that they could take elsewhere. There was no handicraft involved, just acting as a fleshy machine part. This is, again, quite logically called de-skilling, the other term on the slide. Finally, owners considered safety precautions to be a waste of money. A worker's finger could not be replaced, but the worker could be. I said that would come back to Ford and his contribution to both speed up and de-skilling. Ford is largely credited for bringing assembly line production to peak levels. Ford also was one employer who tried experiments with not actually treating his labor completely miserably. We may look more at that when we look at labor and again with the growth of the middle class. This is a Ford assembly line that you see here. We've seen the boom-bust cycle that linked the United States and Europe in an earlier lecture. This included the 1873 depression brought on by the collapse of railroad expansion, failure of banks, and 20-day closure of the New York Stock Exchange. I alluded to this when I said that more than 100 smaller railway lines had failed or gone into bankruptcy by 1874, making it possible for big railroad companies to get even bigger on the cheap. That was 1873. 20 years later, in the Panic of 1893, things got worse. France saw an economic downturn in 1889. Great Britain and Germany followed, and the collapse of speculative projects in European colonial outposts in what we now call the Global South caused banks in both Europe and the US that had financed that speculation to falter. Many railroads had been financed by British banks that were in trouble, and money in railroad speculation led to the Panic of 1893. The poster on the slide is from a play about the Panic of 1893 that came out a couple of years later. The outcome on the ground in the US was that by the peak of the ensuing depression, 15,000 companies and 500 banks had failed, erasing the money that had been entrusted to them. So it's 1893, you put your money in a bank, the bank fails, there's nothing to help you get any of that money back, it's gone. Failure and bankruptcy meant loss of jobs, and jobs in cities were hit hardest. New York City saw unemployment reach 35%. Economic volatility made life precarious at all levels, except the very top that we looked at a bit ago. Business people, small farmers, laborers, and their families could get slammed in a moment, and there was no help or support except that organized by the middle and lower classes themselves. So nothing taken care of by government at any level. These are a group of the unemployed in Chicago. In the next lecture, we will look at the direct direction taken by labor and go on to the middle class in the lecture after that. Key points to Lecture 10. Industrial growth snowballed in the late 19th century as new industries required more new industries for parts and materials. Cities grew around and with factories housing hundreds of thousands of workers in a confined space without sanitation, plumbing, or electricity, meaning that cooking and heating and light depended on flame. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread rapidly and took a large toll on life, especially among the urban poor. The self-made men who became the titans of industry and banking spent absolute fortunes on palatial homes, but quibbled with workers about even small increases in wages. Labor in factories came from both immigration from Europe and migration from rural areas. Bosses wanted to get more out of workers without raising wages and came up with scientific management techniques to make every movement of a worker efficient and assembly lines to keep work moving. These strategies increased productivity and profits for owners, but left workers exhausted from speed up and unable to take their labor to a higher paying factory because of de-skilling. Boom bust cycles made life precarious for the lower and middle classes, while leaving the ultra wealthy largely unaffected. The Panic of 1893 forced millions out of work in both Europe and America. In the US, there were no social programs to ease the struggles of poverty. This coda here is from the collection of the Frick Museum, only part of the collection. Elaborate women's clothing was part of Gilded Age presentation for the elite, and a woman was expected to enhance her husband's business through society events. A number of dresses in the Frick collection that I mentioned in the main lecture date back to the 1880s, as do these two. They were probably worn by Adelaide Frick during the whirl of social occasions that followed her engagement to and marriage to Henry Clay Frick. The garment on the left is a reception dress, clearly never meant to be worn outdoors, although there would be some lace or cotton sewn underneath to get most of the dirt that could be replaced. The one on the right is a dinner or evening dress by London dressmaker Lewis and Allenby. It features intricate hand embroidery and beading, and it was not unusual to import clothing from London and Paris. This hat dates to the 1890s and is made of file mostly, which is a closely woven silk with a ridged texture, is spelled Faille, and georgette, which is a sheer crepe woven to produce a dull, pebbly look. The cream silk with the black stripes would have been worn in the back, so you know that's the back of the house. The hat's most notable element, of course, is its decoration of a bird's head and wings. Bird feathers have a long history of use in clothing, headwear, and jewelry. But in the Gilded Age, this was taken to the extreme, as feathers, wings, and even entire stuffed birds were popularly used to trim women's hats. The mass slaughter of birds for the millinery trade was a key factor in the creation of the Audubon Society in 1895. According to notes from Helen Clay Frick, her mother, Adelaide Frick, wore this ensemble that you see here from the French designer Gustave Beer to a reception given at the White House by President Theodore Roosevelt. Dating to 1905, its S-curve, if you saw it from the side, or monobosom from this view, silhouette, was the height of fashion at the time. The combination of luxurious gold and copper trimmings with rich ivory velvet were hallmarks of the designer Gustave Beer. He was as sought after as Worth, although not as well known now. This gown is one of 8 evening dresses by Lichtenstein C. Mode that remain in the collection at the Frick Pittsburgh. Although the design house is not well known today, it provided haute couture pieces for an elite clientele, including the Fricks. Adelaide wore one of their designs to Helen's debut, and receipts from the family archives show both mother and daughter were ordering dresses between the years 1899 and 1911. This particular piece dates to around 1910. Our background this time has been a detail of a woman's high-end cycling suit. This is from the Met Museum and not from the Frick. This particular ensemble features a bifurcated skirt that allowed the rider a more comfortable ride while also giving the appearance of a skirt at the front. Other ensembles featured fully bifurcated knickerbockers, such as those seen in the advertisement on the left. Both suits also include a pair of gaiters. Those are these things buttoned on down here, which would provide protection for the lower legs.